My name is Teresa Morgan, and for most of my adult life, my world was centered around a quiet two-story house on Willow Ridge Lane, tucked just outside the soft edges of Sterling Creek, Colorado. It wasn't a mansion or anything glamorous, just a warm, steady home with weathered wooden siding, a porch swing that creaked when the wind brushed past it, and a narrow gravel driveway that always left little stones in my shoes. But to me, it was everything. I bought that house when I was 26, after years of saving for my accounting job, and I poured myself into it in ways no one in my family ever truly appreciated. I painted the kitchen cabinets a soft pale green, the color I once saw in a bakery window in Savannah, Georgia. I fixed the back porch myself one summer, hammering in new boards as the sun beat down on my shoulders. I arranged flowers in the bay window, paid the mortgage on time every month, and watched my life grow into something stable inside those walls. I thought that stability meant safety, but I learned quickly that family can ruin stability faster than any storm. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of cold, brittle day where the light feels too pale and the sky too heavy. I had just returned from work, still holding a stack of paperwork and the leftover sandwich I didn't finish at lunch. When I reached my front walkway, something felt wrong. At first, I thought maybe a package had been left on the porch, but then I saw movement through the window. Someone was inside. My heart thumped, not in fear, but in confusion, because I always locked my door. When I stepped inside, I froze. Standing in my living room, surrounded by half-unpacked suitcases, were my brother Dylan and his wife Clarissa. Now, I want to make something clear. Dylan and I were never close. He had always been the golden boy in my mother's eyes, the reckless son who made terrible decisions but still received praise for simply breathing. He bounced from job to job, city to city, and crisis to crisis, dragging poor Clarissa along with him. The last I heard, they were living in Newport, Virginia, and complaining loudly to anyone who would listen about how unfair life was. And now, suddenly, they were in my house. Teresa. Oh my God. It's been forever, Clarissa said, waving at me like we were old friends. Her smile was bright enough to blind a person, but there was something desperate behind it. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was too busy staring at the chaos. Coats draped on my sofa, shoes kicked off near the front door, a suitcase opened on my rug like a spilled secret. Before I could even form a sentence, the door behind me opened again, letting in a gust of cold air, and my mother stepped in. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't even blink at the shock on my face. Instead, she brushed the snow off her coat like she was entering her own home and said, with the tone of someone issuing a command, "Teresa, clear out your room for your brother." For a moment, I genuinely believed I had misheard her. My room? I repeated. Mom, what are you talking about? This is my house. She stepped forward, mouth pressed tight, eyes sharp in that way they always were when I dared to question her. Your brother needs stability, she said firmly. They've been struggling, and Clarissa's not well. They need space, and you have it. Stop being selfish. I could feel heat rising in my chest, not embarrassment, but anger. Pure, bewildered anger. Mom, I said slowly, I bought this house. I pay the mortgage. I pay the loan. I pay every bill that comes into this place. Why would I give up my own room? Her expression hardened instantly. Don't talk back to me, she snapped. Your brother is going through a lot, and you're being dramatic. Dylan didn't say a word. He just looked at me with that entitled, pitiful expression he always wore whenever Mom came to his rescue, as if he fully believed he deserved my room simply for existing. I shook my head. No, I said, finally finding my voice. I'm not doing this. They can't just move in here. You didn't even ask me. My refusal must have been unbearable to her, because in less than a second, her hand flew across my face. The slap was sharp, fast, and humiliating. It wasn't the pain that stunned me, it was the shock. My own mother, hitting me in my own house because I wouldn't give up my room to a grown man who had never held a stable job for more than 6 months. She pointed toward the door, her voice rising with a fury I didn't recognize. Your time is up, she shouted. If you won't cooperate, then get out. I stood there, motionless, barely understanding what she was saying. Get out, she repeated.
Now.
I looked at Dylan, hoping, maybe foolishly, that he would step in. Defend me. Say something. Anything. But he just shifted his weight awkwardly and avoided my eyes. Clarissa clutched her purse to her chest like she was watching a dramatic scene she didn't want to interrupt. That was it. That was the moment everything in my life split in two. I grabbed my keys and my purse, leaving behind the sandwich, the paperwork, and every ounce of peace I had worked so hard to build inside those walls. When I stepped out of the house, the cold air felt cleaner than the air inside had felt in years. I didn't look back at the windows. I didn't turn around when the door slammed behind me. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I walked to my car, stones that had always annoyed me before but now felt like the first steps of an escape. I slid into the driver's seat, closed the door, and sat there, breathing in the silence. That was the day I learned that people can take almost anything from you, your time, your money, your effort, but the moment they try to take your dignity is the moment you have to walk away. Even if the house behind you is one you built with your own hands. And that was the day my life truly began to change. The first night after my mother forced me out of my own home, I sat alone in my car outside a small roadside motel in Boulder Springs, Colorado, letting the engine idle as the cold crept in through the cracks of the doors. The neon motel sign flickered with a sickly blue light, humming louder than my heartbeat, and for a long time I couldn't bring myself to step inside. I just stared at the steering wheel, my hands resting on it like I needed something solid to grip, something that still belonged to me. Everything I had built for myself, every dollar I earned, every late-night shift I had taken, every coat of paint I brushed onto those walls, had been ripped away from me with a single, vicious slap and 3 words: "Your time's up." I finally checked into the motel just before midnight, the clerk barely glancing at me as I handed him my ID. My room smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet, and the heater rattled every time it kicked on, but I didn't complain. My whole life had collapsed in a matter of minutes. The last thing I cared about was the comfort of a motel bed. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The numbers kept running through my mind like a loop I couldn't turn off. $2, $900 for the mortgage, $1,300 for the loan, every single month. I had paid all of it. I had carried that weight alone. Meanwhile, Dylan and Clarissa hadn't held a stable job between them for more than half a year. They drifted from one city to another, Salem, Oregon, then Newport, Virginia, then somewhere in Montana for a few weeks, leaving behind overdue rent and broken promises everywhere they went. And somehow, I was the one kicked out. The absurdity of it made my stomach twist. I tried to tell myself that my mother would come to her senses, call me, apologize, explain herself. But as the hours passed, the silence from her became its own answer. I had always known she favored Dylan, but I had never let myself believe she would go this far. Families are supposed to protect you, not throw you onto the street because someone else snapped their fingers. I spent 3 nights in that motel, trying to figure out my next move. On the 4th morning, something inside me hardened. Not anger, exactly, but something sharper, clearer. A decision. I wasn't going to crawl back and beg. I wasn't going to fight for a place that should have been mine from the beginning. If they wanted to take the house so badly, then fine. Let them. Let them handle the bills. Let them face the loan I had been carrying like a backpack made of stone. Let them cook in the kitchen I renovated, sit on the porch I repaired, and pretend they had built something while doing absolutely nothing. I packed my bags, checked out, and drove toward the downtown district of Boulder Springs, where an old brick building sat between a bookstore and a florist. On the 2nd floor was a tiny studio apartment for rent, barely big enough for a bed, a small table, and a narrow kitchenette. But when the landlord, Eleanor Wells, opened the door for me, the warm smell of fresh bread drifted up from the bakery she and her husband, Patrick, owned on the ground floor. The scent wrapped around me like a blanket, comforting and honest. Something about that smell made me take a slow, deep breath for the first time in days. "You're welcome to take it month to month," Eleanor told me, her voice gentle, the kind of gentle my own mother never used with me. "We get quiet tenants here." It's safe. It's simple. And Patrick makes the best cranberry scones on this side of Colorado. I signed the lease that same afternoon. Moving in was easy. I only had 2 duffel bags of clothes, a box of personal papers, and my laptop. Everything else had been left behind in the house on Willow Ridge Lane. Every shirt I hung in the little wooden closet felt like a step away from my old life. Every plate I stacked on the shelf felt like I was learning to breathe again. My apartment was small, but it was mine. My name was on the lease. My money paid for it. My choices kept me safe. No one could walk in and tell me to get out. No one could slap me across the face for saying no. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like freedom. I told no one where I moved except my closest friend, Amelia Hart, who lived in Brookfield, Ohio. Amelia had always been the one person who listened without trying to fix me. When I told her what happened, her voice cracked with disbelief. "You didn't deserve any of that, Teresa," she said. "I'm proud of you for leaving." Her words hit me harder than I expected. No one had said they were proud of me in a very long time. A month passed with no contact from my family. I settled into a calm routine, waking early, walking down the stairs to buy a warm pastry from Patrick, driving to my job at the accounting office, coming home to read by the window overlooking the street. Some nights I treated myself to a takeout meal from a nearby Italian place run by a woman named Marina Keller, who always insisted on giving me extra bread. The world felt small but safe. Predictable.
Mine.
Then one Thursday afternoon, while I was reviewing a stack of invoices at work, my phone buzzed. I expected it to be Amelia or maybe a reminder notification. But when I turned it over and saw the name on the screen, the room seemed to tilt slightly.
Mom.
For a moment, I just stared at the screen, frozen. After a month of silence, she was suddenly calling me. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to let it ring out, to keep the peace I had built so carefully. But another part of me wanted to hear what excuse she would offer, what version of reality she had convinced herself was true. So I answered. "Teresa." She snapped instantly, without greeting, without hesitation, without even pretending to soften her tone. "Why haven't you sent the $4,200 yet?" It felt like someone had poured ice water down my back. So that was it. That was the reason for the call. Not concern. Not regret. Not curiosity about whether I was alive, safe, or breathing. Money. It always came back to money, my money. A strange, almost amused disbelief bubbled up inside me. "What $4,200? I asked calmly. "The rent and the loan," she barked. "Your responsibility." The laugh that escaped me was loud, unexpected, and real. My mother fell silent on the other end of the line, stunned. That moment, that laugh, became the crack in the foundation of everything I had tolerated for years, a crack wide enough to finally let the truth shine through. And I realized something I had never allowed myself to believe. My breaking point had already happened. This call was simply the confirmation. When my mother barked those first words at me over the phone, "Why haven't you sent the $4,200 yet?" I remember feeling nothing at first. Not anger, not fear, not shock. Just a strange emptiness, as if her voice were coming from the end of a tunnel, and I was standing here on solid ground while she remained stuck in some distant world where logic never existed. I had picked up the call out of curiosity, not concern. That should have told me everything right there. A daughter who is curious, not worried, that is the sign of a relationship long deteriorated. Her tone was clipped, impatient, already annoyed with me without knowing where I was or how I was doing. "The rent and the loan. You know, your responsibility," she snapped again, her breath sharp through the phone speaker. And that was the moment something in my chest loosened. Not broke, loosened. Like an over-tightened, not finally being pulled apart. I laughed. A real laugh. Loud, sudden, and completely uncontrollable. It came from a place deep inside me, a place that finally understood the absurdity of the expectation she still clung to. For years I had carried the house, the bills, the burden. And now, after she had thrown me out like an unwanted tenant, she was demanding I continue paying for the privilege of being excluded. "Mom," I said once I caught my breath. I don't live there anymore. You kicked me out. Remember? There was the tiniest pause on her end. Not long, but long enough to reveal she hadn't expected me to challenge her. She had expected compliance, submission, gratitude even. You don't talk to me like that, she hissed. Send the money today. I didn't bother replying. I simply hung up. My hands didn't tremble. My breathing didn't quicken. I felt calm. That alone startled me. It was as if the act of hanging up had physically cut one of the chains wrapped around my ribs. But my mother wasn't done. Not even close. The first call came back 30 seconds later. I declined it. Then a second. Then a third. Within an hour, I had 6 missed calls, 4 angry texts, and 2 voicemails that alternated between insults and guilt trips. One message claimed she had sacrificed everything for me. The next demanded the money. Another told me Dylan was stressed, and therefore I should be more supportive. Another accused me of abandoning the family. I ignored them all. The silence between my non-responses grew louder and stronger than her shouting ever had. After work, I drove home to my little studio above Eleanor and Patrick's bakery. The moment I opened my door, the warm, yeasty scent of fresh dough and cooling pastries drifted up from below. It felt like stepping into a sanctuary. My sanctuary. The space was small, but peaceful. The bed tucked into the corner, the tiny kitchenette with mismatched plates, the worn armchair I had picked up from a thrift store in Arden Hills, Minnesota, weeks earlier. Nothing here belonged to my past. I brewed tea, stepped out onto my little balcony, and let the cool Colorado air settle around me. Down on the street, the lights flickered in the windows of a florist across the road. A pair of teenagers walked by laughing, wrapped in scarves and levity. Somewhere a dog barked. Life moved on without even glancing at the storm brewing in my phone. The next morning, my mother tried again. More calls. More messages. They grew more demanding each day, then more desperate, then more manipulative as she realized I wasn't breaking. My phone vibrated constantly, a mechanical heartbeat that carried none of the warmth of a real one. I silenced it. Eventually, I started leaving it in my coat pocket just so I wouldn't feel it pulsing on the table beside me. One Saturday, needing a change of scenery, I decided to take a short weekend trip with Amelia. She had been urging me for weeks to get out of town, breathe new air, and I finally agreed. We drove west to Riversend, Oregon, a peaceful coastal town with quiet beaches and small cafes. We spent 2 days walking along the shoreline, letting the icy waves wash over our boots while gulls cried above us. The sky there always seemed a little bigger, stretched wider across the ocean like it was giving me space I'd never been offered before. One evening at sunset, as Amelia and I sat on a bench overlooking the water, the sky erupted into streaks of copper, lavender, and soft gold. Amelia nudged me lightly with her elbow. "You look like someone who finally exhaled," she said. I smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't force itself, the kind that comes naturally when the air feels gentle instead of sharp. Maybe I finally did. On the drive back, I muted several more calls from my mother and listened to the quiet hum of the car engine instead. For the first time, her voice no longer held any power over my emotions. It was just noise. Noise from a life I had walked away from. When I returned to Boulder Springs, the bakery smelled of cinnamon and something sweet Patrick was experimenting with. I bought a small box of pastries and carried them upstairs. The simple act of placing them on my table in my home, felt like replanting myself in soil that finally nourished me. That night, as the sun dipped behind the buildings and the street lamps cast their gentle glow, I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea, watching the world move in soft, steady motions. The air was cool enough to make my breath visible. The lights flickered in the distance, like little reminders that life continues, whether we cling to the past or not. And then the realization came, not as a jolt, not as a dramatic epiphany, but as a warm familiarity settling into my bones. I didn't owe them anything. Not the money. Not the explanations. Not my presence. Not my peace. The life I had been building, quiet, careful, honest, finally felt like mine. I wasn't holding it up for anyone else. I wasn't carrying the weight of other people's irresponsibility. I wasn't apologizing for the space I occupied. That evening, as the tea cooled in my hands and the soft hum of the bakery's dishwasher buzzed below me, I understood what true freedom felt like. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't triumphant. It was quiet, solid, and deeply peaceful. For the first time in my life, I could see a beautiful life waiting for me, one that didn't require me to shrink, sacrifice, or suffer to make others comfortable. A life where I belonged to myself. The week after my mother's final barrage of calls was quieter than anything I had experienced in years. It was the kind of quiet that feels earned, like the hush that follows the end of a storm. I sat at my tiny kitchen table one morning, sunlight pooling across the worn wood, and scrolled through my contact list with a clear, steady purpose. One tap, block. Another tap, block. Then another. My mother, my brother Dylan, his wife Clarissa. Every doorway they had into my life, shut. The digital silence that followed wasn't empty. It felt like the first breath of air after resurfacing from deep underwater. For the first time in a long time, I woke up without dread sitting on my chest like a stone. There were no sudden jolts in the night, no racing heartbeats at the thought of another crisis, another demand. I felt lighter. Not because life had magically become perfect, but because I finally stopped carrying burdens that were never mine. My mornings became peaceful. I would pad across the floor in warm socks, start a pot of coffee, and let the sound of the bakery downstairs drift upward. The clinking of trays, the hum of ovens, the voices of Eleanor and Patrick moving in gentle rhythm. It felt like living above a heartbeat, warm and steady. As the days passed, a new thought began to take shape in my mind, one that had always been buried under obligations and guilt. I could start over. Not by accident, not because someone forced me to, but because I finally had the freedom to choose what my life could look like. I started saving more intentionally, calculating numbers with the same precision I used at work, but with a kind of excitement I hadn't felt since my early 20s. Without paying everyone else's way, suddenly my income stretched farther than I had ever imagined. I found myself daydreaming often about Crescent Bay, California, a place I'd visited only once as a teenager during a school trip. I remembered the cliffs overlooking the ocean and the pastel houses lined along the shore. Back then, I told myself that one day I would live somewhere with a view of the water, somewhere peaceful, calm, and warm. Somewhere that didn't feel like a battlefield disguised as a family home. I had buried that dream for years, telling myself I was being unrealistic. But now that dream sat quietly in the back of my mind, not demanding attention, just gently reminding me it was still there. One night, after a simple dinner of soup and bread from the bakery below, I sat on my small balcony wrapped in a soft blanket I had bought from a thrift shop. The street below glowed with soft amber light from the old-fashioned lanterns the city had installed years ago. People walked by in slow, easy steps, their laughter rising gently into the night air. I opened my laptop and typed into the search bar, "Houses for sale in Crescent Bay, CA." It felt like crossing a line I had never allowed myself to approach. The listings that filled my screen were beautiful, small cottages with sea blue shutters, modern townhouses with rooftop terraces, cozy bungalows with gardens full of rosemary and lavender. I clicked through each one carefully, imagining where I would put a reading chair, what color I would paint the bedroom walls, how it would feel to wake up each morning and hear the ocean instead of stress pounding at my door. One house caught my breath, the smallest one on the page. A little cream-colored cottage with a red front door, tucked between two larger homes on a quiet street only 3 blocks from the water. It had a tiny fenced yard with a lemon tree leaning in the corner, and windows so big that morning light would spill in like honey. It wasn't extravagant, but I didn't want extravagant. I wanted peace. I wanted sunlight. I wanted a place that welcomed me home instead of reminding me of everything I owed. I bookmarked the listing and closed my laptop, but the image stayed with me all night. I could almost feel the warm California breeze brushing against my skin, almost smell the ocean salt. For the first time since the chaos on Willow Ridge Lane, I felt a future blossoming right in front of me, steady, gentle, and completely mine. Days turned into weeks, and each day, I found myself saving a little more, dreaming a little more boldly. I started taking weekend drives to nearby towns in Colorado, exploring quiet cafes, bookstores, parks, anything that made me feel connected to the world again. Some evenings I called Amelia and told her about the houses I'd seen online. "You sound different," she said one night. "Happier. Calmer. Like you're finally stepping into your own life." "I think I am," I told her. And I meant it. One evening, as I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea, watching the streetlights flicker like soft stars pulled down to earth, I whispered to myself, "This is my beginning." It was quiet, but it was real. Not just a statement, an intention, a promise, a declaration of ownership over my own life, something I had never truly claimed before. At work, people noticed I carried myself differently. My shoulders sat lower, my smile came easier, my patience grew. I no longer jumped when my phone buzzed because now it only held people who cared about me, not people who drained me. When Eleanor invited me downstairs for coffee during her slow afternoons, I joined her, listening to stories about her childhood in Dover, England, and how she met Patrick when they were both in culinary school in New Hampshire. Their lives were full of warmth and teamwork, the kind of partnership that didn't take but shared, didn't expect but offered. Watching them made me realize how little true care I had experienced growing up. But now I was learning. As winter softened into early spring, I felt my heart soften with it. The more distance I gained from my mother's demands and Dylan's freeloading, the more clearly I could see the truth. Disconnecting wasn't cruelty. It was survival. It was protection. It was choosing a life I deserved rather than the life I had been conditioned to accept. And as each day passed, the vision of that cream-colored cottage in Crescent Bay grew brighter. I could feel it waiting for me, not as an escape, but as a beginning. A chapter one would write with my own hands, not under the weight of someone else's expectations. The day I hung up that call from my mother, I hadn't just refused money. I had refused the role they wrote for me, caretaker, provider, scapegoat. And the moment I refused, something beautiful stepped out from behind the curtain of my old life. A future where I belonged to myself and to no one's demands but my own. A life earned. A life reclaimed. A life free.